Under the shadow of an old mountain lay a village where death was a visitor too frequent to fear, yet too common to grieve. The people of this land had learned to harden themselves, for every year drought or fever claimed lives and funerals became routine. They dug shallow graves, muttered prayers, and returned to their homes without lingering. Mourning was a luxury, and tears were shed only for those who carried weight in the world: chiefs, warriors, mothers with many children. For the weak, the forgotten, the burdened, there was no song, no wail, no memory carved in stone. Among these forgotten ones was a young woman whose name few bothered to say aloud. She had been born into a family that saw her as nothing more than an extra mouth, a body without worth. Her father had died early, her mother remarried, and with a new household came coldness sharper than hunger. Her stepmother regarded her as a shadow, useful only for chores, for hauling water, for bending her back beneath tasks that others refused. She moved through the village as though invisible, eyes lowered, her voice swallowed before it reached the air. Children mocked her, elders overlooked her, and when she fell ill, none came to her mat to bring herbs or prayers. When her final breath escaped in the stillness of night, the house did not echo with sorrow. Her stepmother merely shook her head, muttered, "Another mouth gone," and ordered the men to dig a grave at dawn. There was no preparation, no washing of the body with care, no woven cloth to wrap her in dignity. She was laid out like a bundle of sticks, thin limbs stiff, eyes half closed, mouth frozen mid-breath. The neighbors came not to mourn but to confirm her passing, their faces flat, their whispers sharp. "It is better this way," they said. "She was never meant to stay." The funeral itself was a hurried thing. A hole was dug at the edge of the yard, far from where flowers grew or where ancestors rested. No songs rose to accompany her spirit. No women beat their chests or wailed as custom demanded for the dead. No child wept for the sister, no man for the daughter, no elder for the girl whose name was already dissolving like dust in wind. Earth was shoveled over her body with indifference, each thud of soil landing heavy, final, erasing her existence. Her stepmother stood at a distance, arms folded, lips pressed in satisfaction. When the last handful of dirt fell, the men smoothed the mound with their spades and walked away without a backward glance. And yet, as the people dispersed, an unease lingered in the air. The sky, which should have been a bright shield of blue, lay strangely muted as though veiled in mourning. The wind stilled, birds refused to sing, and even the goats and chickens wandered restlessly, unsettled by something unseen. Children hushed their laughter, sensing a silence too heavy to be ordinary. It was the kind of silence that presses against the skin, the kind that makes the heart beat quicker though no danger can be seen. Night descended swiftly, shrouding the village in a darkness thicker than usual. The moon rose, pale and thin, but its light seemed swallowed by clouds gathering without warning. People closed their doors earlier than they ever did, as though hiding from an invisible watcher. In the yard where the girl lay buried, the earth trembled ever so slightly, unnoticed by all but the insects crawling across the soil. And above, the first low rumble of thunder whispered across the heavens, a sound like a warning, like a sigh too deep for the world to hold. The villagers slept, but the sky did not. The grave was dug shallow, as if even the earth itself did not wish to embrace her fully. The men who carved the soil worked quickly, their arms moving with the kind of impatience reserved for a task done without meaning. Their spades bit into the ground, throwing up clumps of dark earth that landed with dull thuds. No words were exchanged, no ritual pauses to honor the body that would soon lie within. It was only labor to them, something to be finished before the midday sun grew harsh. When the time came to lower her down, there was no woven mat to cradle her body, no scented leaves or flowers placed beneath her head. In this land, the dead were usually prepared with care. Women would wash the body with warm water, smoothing oil across the skin, braiding the hair one final time as a gesture of love. They would wrap the form in cloth, sometimes white, sometimes patterned with ancestral colors, before carrying it to its resting place. As the mourners walked, they would sing, voices rising in sorrowful unison, each note carrying the weight of loss. The earth would receive the body with dignity, accompanied by tears and chants to guide the spirit safely. But none of that was given to her. Instead, she was carried by two men with calloused hands, her form limp in the old, torn cloth that had served her in life. Her head lolled to one side, hair covering her face, and when her arms slipped free, no one moved to tuck it back with tenderness. They laid her into the hole as though discarding a broken pot, a thing no longer useful. Her stepmother stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes sharp with satisfaction. She whispered to another woman, "At last, the house will breathe easier." That whisper carried not grief, but relief, and though it was not loud, it was cruel enough to stain the silence that surrounded the graveyard. One by one, handfuls of soil were thrown onto her body. In other funerals, these handfuls were gentle gestures, each one an act of farewell. Today they were cold motions, mechanical, detached. The soil hit her chest, her face, her feet, covering her swiftly, smothering the remnants of her existence. Each thud of earth echoed louder than it should have, as though the land itself protested the hurried burial. The children who watched did not cry. Instead, they pointed, whispering with careless curiosity, "She is gone." One boy laughed nervously, and his mother did not scold him. To them, her death was nothing more than another shadow slipping away. The grave filled too quickly. The men tamped down the soil, flattening it, erasing the last visible trace of her body. No one lingered. No prayers were spoken aloud. No libations were poured into the ground. The usual circle of women, who would have rocked back and forth in sorrow, beating their breasts, remained absent. The air did not carry the piercing wail of mourning songs that normally traveled far into the horizon. There was only silence, and in that silence, a heaviness grew. As the villagers drifted back to their homes, the sky shifted. Clouds gathered low and heavy, swallowing the sun, dimming the day into a gray twilight though it was barely afternoon. The wind, which had been still, now pressed against the trees with an unsettled rustle. Birds, usually loud in their chatter after a burial, fell quiet, their wings carrying them far from the yard. Even the goats in the distance grew restless, bleating sharply as if sensing something their human keepers could not. The stepmother, satisfied with the shallow mound, spat once upon the earth before turning away. She called her children to follow, and they obeyed without looking back. But as they left, the youngest glanced at the sky, uneasy. The clouds hung lower now, their bellies swollen with unspent rain. A shiver passed through him though no wind touched his skin. He tugged at his mother's hand, whispering, "The sky looks angry." She hushed him sharply, dragging him along, unwilling to admit what the heavens themselves declared. By evening, the grave stood alone, freshly packed yet already sagging as if the soil resisted keeping what had been placed within. In the village, fires were lit, meals prepared, laughter returned in fragments, but unease remained like a shadow clinging to every doorway. Some elders sat together, frowning at the sudden weight of the sky. They spoke in hushed tones, "The clouds come too soon. It is not the season." Another shook his head, "Perhaps the ancestors stir. Something about this burial feels wrong." Far above, thunder grumbled faintly, a low growl that rolled across the horizon. It was not yet rain, but the promise of it, the warning of skies that had begun to weep even before the first drop fell. And in the silence of the yard where the girl lay forgotten, the air thickened with waiting, as if the heavens themselves held their breath. That night, the village lay under a strange stillness, the kind that comes just before a storm. The air was thick, heavy, pressing down on every chest. Even those who had eaten well could not sleep easily. Dogs whined at their masters' doors, refusing to lie in their kennels. Goats huddled together, stamping their hooves nervously. The moon rose pale and dim, soon swallowed whole by swollen clouds that gathered like dark spirits above the land. Then, without warning, the first crack of thunder split the sky. It was not a gentle rumble but a shattering roar that made the huts tremble and the hearts of the villagers leap with fear. The rain came soon after, heavy and relentless, pouring down in sheets so thick that the world outside vanished behind a silver curtain. It struck the thatched roofs with the sound of drums beaten by unseen hands. It carved rivulets through the dust of the paths, washing away footprints, smearing the edges of walls. In the yard where the girl lay buried, the soil softened quickly, sinking as though trying to expel the body that had been forced inside it. Each drop seemed to strike with purpose, as if the heavens themselves poured out their grief in place of the people who had given none. Villagers peered out from their doorways, their faces pale in the flickering light of oil lamps. Some muttered, "Why does the rain fall so hard? It is not the season." Others crossed themselves, whispering prayers they did not usually say. Children clung to their mothers, startled by the brightness of lightning that cut the sky into jagged pieces. Between the thunder and the rain, one question grew louder, passed from mouth to mouth. Why would the sky weep for a girl no one loved? In truth, the storm felt less like weather and more like lament. The rhythm of the rainfall carried sorrow, each gust of wind a wail too ancient for human throats. The thunder shook the ground as though the earth itself resented the cruelty it had witnessed, as though it wished to spit back what had been buried without care. Elders remembered tales told long ago, of the heavens avenging the forgotten dead, of storms that came when souls were mistreated. Those who remembered kept their fears to themselves, but their eyes betrayed unease. As the hours passed, the rain did not ease. It fell and fell as if there were no end to the grief above. Roofs leaked, mats were soaked, fires sputtered out. The paths that had once been firm turned into streams, carrying mud and leaves downhill. Yet no one dared complain too loudly, for to curse the rain was to invite wrath. Instead, they whispered inside their huts, trading stories of what they had seen at the burial. No one cried for her, one woman said. Not even her blood. Another replied, perhaps that is why the sky mourns in their place. The heavens do not forget what men neglect. Children, unable to sleep, pressed their ears to the walls and listened to their elders' hushed words. Their eyes widened at the suggestion that the dead girl's spirit might be wandering in the rain, searching for the tears she was denied. Some swore they heard footsteps outside their huts, slow and dragging, splashing in the mud. One boy claimed he saw her face in a flash of lightning, pale and dripping with water, staring from the edge of the yard. His father slapped him for speaking nonsense, but even he did not open the door to prove otherwise. The storm grew wilder, the lightning brighter, searing the night with blinding light. Each strike seemed aimed at the earth, stabbing close to the graveyard, shaking huts and rattling clay pots. The people covered their heads, trembling as the sky roared its fury. The youngest children wept while their mothers soothed them, though their own voices trembled. It felt less like rain and more like judgment. By midnight, the ground was sodden, the streams swollen, the air thick with the smell of wet soil and smoke. The mound of her grave had begun to sink under the pounding of the rain, edges dissolving into muddy rivulets. It looked less like a resting place and more like a wound that refused to heal. The few who dared glance toward it from their windows swore they saw the earth shifting slightly, as if it breathed beneath the downpour. None spoke of it aloud, but the image seared itself into their hearts. Still the rain did not stop. It was as though the sky's grief was endless, as if it carried more sorrow than the land could bear. Thunder followed thunder, each louder than the last, shaking the ground like drums announcing war. And between the cracks of light, some swore they heard another sound, something softer, almost human. A sigh, a whisper, a cry. The villagers huddled deeper in their homes, their whispers fading into silence. No one dared step outside. No one dared approach the grave. For though they had buried her without tears, the sky itself had chosen to weep in their place, and with every drop that struck the earth, it seemed to promise that this storm was not only mourning, it was warning. That night, even as the storm raged on, sleep came unevenly to the villagers. Some lay tossing under their blankets, troubled by the relentless pounding of rain against the roofs, while others drifted into dreams that felt far too real. In these dreams, the young woman appeared, her face pale and sorrowful, eyes glistening with a grief no one had shared in life. She did not speak at first, only watched, her gaze heavy and accusing, as if measuring the hearts of those who had forsaken her. The stepmother was the first to wake trembling, her sheets damp with sweat. In her dream, the girl stood at the edge of the bed, hair wet and clinging to her face, eyes dark and unblinking. "Why did you not love me?" the figure asked without moving her lips, and though no sound escaped, the words echoed in the stepmother's mind like a chorus of knives. She tried to turn away, tried to cover her eyes, but the vision persisted, following her from room to room, lingering as she went about her daily chores. Even in waking hours she could feel the weight of those eyes, piercing her thoughts, turning every breath into guilt she could not escape. Children in the village whispered among themselves, hesitant but insistent. Some claimed they had seen a shadow moving near the grave, a figure so fleeting that it vanished when approached, leaving only a chill in the air. "It's her," a small voice said one morning as the rain finally softened, pointing to the mound of damp soil. "I saw her watching me." Other children nodded in agreement, wide-eyed, recounting similar fleeting glimpses. A hand brushing the edge of a tree, a figure gliding past the corner of a hut, always pale, always silent. The adults tried to dismiss these stories, but unease settled in like fog. Even the bravest men avoided walking past the grave alone. Whispers spread through the village, "She is restless. Her spirit does not sleep. The heavens mourn and now she walks in dreams." Those who had remained indifferent to her life began to sense something heavier than simple regret. Even those who had never cared for her could feel her presence, a subtle weight pressing against the edges of their perception. Some reported that at night, objects shifted slightly, mats moved, doors creaked open on their own. A soft cold followed her imagined footsteps, a reminder that she had not been laid to rest with the dignity owed to the living and dead alike. Farmers who had gone to their fields at dawn found themselves stopping mid-step, staring at the sky and murmuring prayers they did not fully understand. The wind seemed to carry whispers of her voice, gentle but insistent. Those who had ignored her life now felt compelled to at least acknowledge her spirit, if only in the smallest, most fearful ways. Windows left open clanged shut on their own, doors that had been firmly latched swung ajar, and stray animals ran as if sensing a presence invisible to human eyes. Even the stepmother's children, who had long treated her with contempt, began to speak in hushed tones of strange dreams. In one, the girl knelt by their beds, her pale hands reaching out as if to touch, yet never fully making contact. They woke with their hearts pounding, blankets soaked, whispers caught in their throats. The youngest refused to leave his mother's side, claiming that he could feel her watching, waiting, judging the household's indifference. By nightfall, the sense of tension in the village had become nearly unbearable. Those who had once walked freely through the streets now hurried along, eyes darting to shadows, listening for sounds carried on the damp wind. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered, and with it, the invisible presence of the girl they had buried without tears. She existed now not in body but in essence, an unyielding reminder of the cruelty of neglect, the injustice of a life disregarded, and the silent power that sorrow could wield even from beneath the soil. Though no one spoke her name aloud, everyone felt her. Her gaze lingered in the corners of rooms, her shadow slipped along walls, and her absence became a force that unsettled even the hardest hearts. The girl, though buried, was present, and the village, once indifferent to her existence, could no longer ignore her silent insistence. Weeks passed, and still the rain fell, endless and relentless, as if the heavens had chosen the village as a vessel for their grief. The first few days had been shocking enough, a storm unusual for the season, but now the downpour had become a constant presence, drumming against rooftops, washing paths into streams, and filling the air with the scent of wet earth and decay. Villagers walked with heads down, shoulders hunched, water dripping from their hair and clothes, each step a battle against the puddles and mud that clung to their feet. There was no longer laughter in the streets, no cries of children at play. Only the rain, the wind, and the soft, insistent whispers of those who dared to speak. The crops began to suffer first. Fields that had been planted with care now lay submerged, the young shoots bending beneath the weight of unrelenting water. The grains rotted in their husks, roots loosened from the soaked soil, and the villagers' anxious murmurs grew louder with each passing day. Goats and cattle struggled in the sodden pastures, hooves sinking into mud, their cries echoing across the wet hills. Chickens huddled in the corners of pens, feathers plastered to their bodies, clucking frantically as if the rain itself were chasing them. The people tried to coax the animals to dry ground, but the flood of water made every path treacherous, and the sense of helplessness grew heavier with each failed attempt. Homes, too, began to suffer. Thatched roofs sagged under the relentless weight of water, leaking into rooms that were already damp from endless storms. Families moved their bedding again and again, only to find it soaked by morning. Fires sputtered and went out, leaving smoke to mingle with the cold, wet air. Some walls began to crack from the constant pressure, small stones dislodging to tumble into the mud outside. And yet, even as the village deteriorated, no one dared speak of stopping the rain, for all knew that it was no ordinary storm. It was the sky's mourning, a grief too powerful to command or control. The elders, sensing the unnatural weight of the weather, called for rituals long forgotten. They gathered near the central square, arranging offerings of grain and incense, speaking prayers to the ancestors and the spirits of the land. They invoked blessings for rain to cease and for the unrest souls to find peace. But even these rites seemed powerless. The rain fell as if mocking their prayers, drumming louder on rooftops and filling the air with a heavy scent of wet soil and sorrow. Some whispered that perhaps the rituals were not enough because the soul they sought to honor had been buried without love, without tears, without the respect owed to the living and the dead alike. In the heart of the village, the grave where the young woman had been laid began to betray its shallow construction. The rain, falling in sheets without pause, softened the soil until the mound sagged visibly. Where once it had been a small rise over the earth, it now sank, edges collapsing, the soil swallowing itself as though rejecting the body within. Some villagers, braving the mud and water, glanced toward it in uneasy silence. The mound seemed almost alive, a subtle tremor running through the soaked earth as if the girl beneath it stirred against her confinement. They said nothing aloud, but a chill passed through each who dared look, and many turned quickly, unable to meet the sight for long. Even those who had once ignored her began to notice the effects of her presence. Families that had treated her life with indifference now walked carefully, speaking softly, eyes darting toward the grave whenever the wind shifted. Children refused to go near the yard, claiming that the rain brought a shadow they could not explain. Elders muttered warnings about spirits, about the anger of the forgotten, about the power of sorrow left unchecked. The rain became both punishment and message, a reminder that cruelty toward the defenseless could never go unanswered. Night after night, the storm continued, relentless, the sky heavy with grief. And beneath the collapsing mound, the girl's presence remained, a silent force pressing upward through the softened earth. The villagers, wet and weary, began to understand that their neglect, their cruelty, had not ended with her burial. Instead, it had awakened something they could neither fight nor ignore, a sorrow so vast that even the heavens could not contain it. Night after night, as the rain softened into a persistent drizzle, strange sounds began to emerge from the yard where the girl had been buried. At first, they were subtle, soft thuds that seemed out of place, a faint shifting of soil that no wind nor animal could explain. The villagers who lived closest to the grave began to hear it first. Some dismissed it as the groaning of trees under the weight of water, or the settling of the earth after weeks of relentless rain, but a growing number could not ignore the rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, almost alive. It was a heartbeat, slow and steady, pulsing beneath the soaked soil. Those who heard it described it in whispers, barely daring to speak aloud. "It is her," one old man said, his voice quivering. "The girl, she moves beneath the earth. She is not gone." Others shook their heads, fearful and incredulous, insisting that a buried body could not possibly make such sounds. But the rhythm persisted, soft yet insistent, like a drum calling the villagers to attention even as their hearts trembled with unease. Some braver, or perhaps more desperate, villagers decided to investigate. Under the veil of night, they crept toward the grave with spades and lanterns, the faint light bouncing off the rain-soaked ground. Their hands trembled as they lifted the first layer of mud, revealing the dark, damp soil beneath. For a moment they thought it was just the rain making the ground unstable, but then they heard it clearly. A thump like a pulse beneath their feet, steady and slow, unmistakable. Fear gripped them so tightly that they could barely lift their lanterns to see. One whispered, It is her heart." Another dropped the spade and stumbled backward, mud splattering over him as he fled into the shadows. None of them could continue. No courage was strong enough to face what moved beneath the earth. Meanwhile, inside the house, the stepmother scoffed at the rumors. "Do you hear them?" she snapped at her children, voice sharp as broken glass. "They speak of nonsense, of shadows and whispers. Let her stay buried. Let her rot where she belongs." Her eyes, dark and hard, did not soften even as the rain pattered against the windows, a relentless rhythm that seemed almost alive in itself. She feared nothing from the living, yet even she could not silence the unease that had begun to settle in the air. Still, she refused to bend, convinced that the girl had no right to disturb the household now or ever again. The nights grew colder, and the whispers beneath the soil became louder, more confident, as if the girl beneath was testing the boundaries of the earth that held her. Some villagers began to see shapes near the grave when the moon emerged, shadows stretching and twisting, though no one could explain their origin. Dogs barked and fled in the darkness, goats huddled in corners of pens, and even the wind seemed to carry faint echoes of a human sigh. The pulse beneath the ground never faltered, steady as the beating of the heavens themselves, a secret drum only the daring or unfortunate could hear. Attempts to dig again failed. Every time a villager raised a spade, an invisible weight seemed to press against them, forcing hesitation. Some swore they felt hands gripping their own, pulling them away though no one was there. Others claimed the earth itself trembled, small fissures opening at the edges of the mound, threatening to swallow them along with the girl. Fear spread like wildfire. Soon none dared approach the grave alone. Groups of men lingered at its edge, whispering prayers they had almost forgotten, hoping that vigilance would protect them from whatever stirred beneath the soil. The stepmother, though aware of the growing tension, did nothing to soothe it. Her insistence was sharp, cruel, final. "Let her rot," she told anyone who suggested otherwise. "We did our duty. We buried her. She has no more place here." Yet even as she spoke, the air around her seemed charged, trembling slightly, as though the girl beneath the earth listened to every word, catalogued every insult, and waited. The earth beneath the yard seemed alive now, responsive, a thin membrane between the world of the living and the unyielding presence that refused to stay silent. And so the village held its breath, night after night, listening to the quiet thrum beneath the soil. Some called it madness, some called it grief, but all agreed on one thing: the girl was not gone. Beneath the soaked earth, beneath the shallow mound they had dug in haste, she waited. And the world, damp and shadowed, seemed to lean closer, straining to hear the rhythm of a heart that refused to die. The night had deepened into a blackness so complete that even the familiar shapes of the village vanished under sheets of rain and swirling mist. The storm had reached its peak, thrashing with a fury that seemed almost conscious, as if the heavens themselves had prepared for this moment. Lightning split the sky, jagged and blinding, illuminating the soaked earth in sudden, ghostly brilliance. Thunder followed, a rolling roar that shook the ground and rattled the huts. Each strike landed closer to the mound of her grave, and the air quivered with anticipation, electric and heavy. Beneath the shallow soil, the girl's coffin shuddered. At first, it was a faint tremor, barely noticeable over the drumbeat of the rain. Then the shaking grew stronger, jolting the coffin with a force that made the surrounding earth collapse in small tumbling heaps. Cracks snaked through the mud, zigzagging across the mound like lightning frozen in the soil. Rain poured into these fissures, soaking the wood, seeping into the gaps, and the ground seemed to inhale, then exhale with a life of its own. Villagers who dared to look from their windows could barely comprehend the sight. The mound itself appeared to breathe, rising and falling as though something underneath demanded release. And then it happened. With a violent crack that sounded like the breaking of the world, the coffin burst open. Splinters flew in every direction, carried by the gusts of the storm. Water cascaded over the edges, and from within emerged the girl, soaked and trembling but alive. Her hair clung to her face in dark, dripping strands, wild and untamed, and her skin glowed faintly in the flashes of lightning, pale yet strangely luminous, as if touched by the sorrow of the skies. She pushed herself upright, standing at the edge of the collapsing grave, her eyes wide, dark, and unwavering. Her first breath was deep, shaking the air with a force that seemed to ripple across the village. The rain paused for a moment, dripping in slow, hesitant streaks from the eaves, as if nature itself held its breath. Then a wind swept through the fields, bending the trees and carrying the scent of wet earth and rebirth. The animals fell silent, sensing the power that had risen from beneath the ground. Even the storm seemed to bow slightly, lightning flashing in jagged arcs that illuminated her in the center of the chaos. From the village, terrified whispers rose like a chorus of disbelief. Windows rattled, doors slammed, and men and women pressed themselves against walls, peering through rain-streaked glass. "The dead walk among us," one old man murmured, his voice trembling. Others stammered, voices barely audible over the roar of the storm. Children clutched their mothers, faces pale, convinced that the tales of restless spirits were true. Some who had scoffed at the rumors now fell silent, eyes locked on the figure standing tall on the edge of the grave, drenched but unyielding. The stepmother shrieked, the sound slicing through the tumultuous night. She ran to the edge of the yard, eyes wide with terror, hands outstretched, but the girl did not move toward her. Instead, she raised her face to the storm, letting the rain strike it as if washing away the injustice she had suffered. Her eyes glimmered with sorrow and rage, deep and ancient, and every drop of rain that touched her seemed to tremble in response, carrying her grief across the village. The soil beneath her feet continued to shift, as if acknowledging her claim on the world once denied. Lightning struck again, closer this time, igniting the top of a nearby tree, sparks scattering like fleeting stars. The villagers flinched, realizing that the storm was no ordinary tempest. It was a partner to her rising, an accomplice in her return. The wind roared, bending reeds and flinging debris across the yard, yet she stood steady, drenched but unbowed. Even the floodwaters swirling around the grave seemed to part slightly, creating a small pool in which she stood, the water rippling outward with each heartbeat that seemed to echo through the earth. Her presence was magnetic and terrifying. The people felt the weight of her gaze as if it could pierce through the thick walls of huts and clay doors. Even those who had ignored her life felt their own guilt rising, pressing against their chests like the relentless rain. Her rise from the grave was not only a return of flesh and blood, but a reclamation of respect denied, a manifestation of grief that refused to remain buried. As the villagers watched, the storm seemed to soften, though it did not stop. Rain fell in steady, deliberate sheets, thunder rolling more gently now, almost like applause. The wind carried with it a strange harmony, the shaking earth beneath the grave now stilling under her command. She moved slowly, deliberately, stepping from the edge of the mound onto the softened ground. Every step sent ripples through the rainwater, every breath seemed to command the storm itself, and the village could do nothing but tremble. By the time she fully emerged, the people understood something fundamental. The girl, long neglected and buried without tears, had returned with the power of sorrow, storm, and defiance. The night was alive with her presence, and every flash of lightning, Every roll of thunder, every drop of rain became an announcement. She was no longer the girl who had been buried. She was the force that had risen from grief, the embodiment of the sky's mourning, and the village would never forget the night when the dead walked among them. The rain had softened into a steady, relentless drizzle by the time she walked through the village paths, each step leaving small ripples in the puddles that reflected her pale, luminous face. Her hair clung to her shoulders in dark, dripping strands, framing eyes that were wide, unyielding, and filled with a sorrow no one could meet. She moved with a quiet authority, her presence bending the air around her, commanding attention without a word. The villagers who dared glance from their windows fell silent, frozen in a mixture of fear and awe. Mothers held their children closer, men pressed against walls, and even the bravest of hunters could not look away. When she reached her childhood home, the door loomed before her, dark and trembling from the storm's wind. She paused for a moment, letting the rain drip from her fingers, her gaze sweeping over the familiar courtyard now sodden and muddy. Her stepmother, hearing the faint splash of footsteps across the yard, stiffened, a chill running down her spine. She had thought the girl's life had ended beneath the shallow earth, yet here she stood, soaked, silent, impossible to ignore. The step-siblings scattered like startled birds, hiding behind walls and furniture, whispering frantic warnings to one another. The girl stepped into the doorway, the frame of the house casting long shadows across her glowing figure. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though she were both observer and judge. The stepmother's lips parted as if to scream, but no sound came. Her chest heaved, panic twisting her features, and her children clung to her skirts, trembling. She wanted to retreat, to flee, but an invisible force held her rooted in place. Silence filled the room, heavy and absolute, more suffocating than any storm outside. The girl's silence was more terrifying than any yell or threat. It carried a weight that pressed against their hearts, a stillness so complete that it seemed to drown out the world. Every drop of rain that fell outside the house echoed in her presence, a reminder that the storm followed her, that nature itself had become her companion. The wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it a chill that seeped into the bones of the family, mingling with the dread that now gripped them. Even the dogs outside whimpered, their cries small against the vast, oppressive quiet that seemed to radiate from her. The stepmother's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, cracked and hoarse. It cannot be, you are gone." Her words trembled under the weight of disbelief and fear, swallowed quickly by the unyielding presence in the doorway. The girl did not answer. Her eyes swept over the room, noting every corner, every hidden glance, every trembling finger. Her gaze landed on the stepmother's hands, clenched tightly at her sides, and the children cowering behind her. No mercy, no apology, no explanation, only observation. Outside, the rain continued to fall, sheets of silver streaking the sky, following each of her movements. It pooled around her feet as she stepped inside, spreading outward like a living cloak of water. The wind carried her presence into every corner, slipping under doors and through windows, leaving the family shivering with a fear they could not name. Every heartbeat seemed amplified, synchronized with the rhythm of droplets striking the ground. The storm had become her herald, a visible and audible declaration that she had returned. The step-siblings, too young to fully understand the weight of what stood before them, cried softly, hiding behind furniture and shaking in terror. They peered from the corners of the room, catching glimpses of her luminous skin, the way her soaked hair clung in dark strands across her face, the faint glow of her eyes even in the dim light. They had expected the dead to remain buried, to stay hidden beneath the soil, but the impossible had occurred. The girl had returned, and she had brought with her the storm, the judgment, the quiet vengeance of a life ignored. Even the stepmother, who had thought herself cunning and in control, felt the room shrink around her. Each breath she took was shallow, each step she contemplated made her knees quake. She realized, though she dared not admit it aloud, that the silence itself was more powerful than any scream, more commanding than any anger she had ever known. Her authority, her cruelty, her control, all had evaporated in the presence of the girl who had risen from the grave. The girl stood at the doorway for long moments, letting the weight of her silence settle over them, letting them understand, without a word, the consequences of their neglect. The rain continued to follow her footsteps, soft at first, then heavier, pooling in small rivers across the floor, as though the storm itself had become an extension of her will. She had returned not for forgiveness, not for comfort, but for the reckoning that the living had failed to provide. And in that quiet, in that suffocating stillness, the family understood the truth. The girl they had buried without tears now held power over them, and her return was only the beginning. The room fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the walls, the ceiling, and the very floor beneath their feet. The only sound was the relentless patter of rain against the eaves, a soft drum that mirrored the tension in the air. Then, slowly, the girl spoke. Her voice broke through the quiet, low at first as though testing the air, and then grew louder, rolling like thunder across the room. "You buried me without tears," she said, each word striking like a hammer, vibrating through the hearts of all who heard it. The rain outside seemed to respond, intensifying, striking the roof with sharp, urgent rhythm, echoing the weight of her words. The stepmother stumbled back, clutching at her chest as if the sound itself could crush her. The children pressed themselves against walls, hiding behind tables and chairs, faces pale, wide-eyed, trembling. The girl's gaze swept over them, piercing, relentless, carrying the sorrow and fury of weeks spent beneath the unforgiving soil. Every glance felt like a question, a silent demand for confession. And one by one they began to speak, voices faltering, breaking under the weight of guilt they had long ignored. "I left her to toil all day and I laughed when she stumbled," muttered the eldest step-sibling, eyes downcast. His words were small, almost lost beneath the rolling thunder, yet they hung in the air, raw and damning. Another whispered, voice trembling, "I never shared my food with her when she asked. I watched her suffer and did nothing." The stepmother's lips quivered, her hands shaking as she tried to summon defiance, but even she could not resist the tide of truth spilling from her children's mouths. The air seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken remorse as the girl listened, silent but unyielding. Her eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to ignite the room. The rain outside became a torrent, drumming against windows and walls, a chorus of nature's mourning joining her judgment. The storm's lightning flashed with each word that hung in the air, illuminating the pale faces of the family, revealing every trace of fear and guilt. The girl's voice rose again, commanding, almost ceremonial, echoing across the soaked courtyard beyond. "You left me to rot, unloved, unwanted. And for that, you shall bear the weight of what you denied me." A shiver ran through the family as the curse fell upon them, invisible yet undeniable. The girl spoke of lives that would remain dry, loveless, tearless. She wove her words with the gravity of one who had touched death and returned, her presence carrying the authority of the storm itself. Crops would wither without care, joy would dissolve before it could take root, and no comfort could reach the hearts of those who had ignored her life. Every syllable was a thread of reckoning, binding them to the consequences of their cruelty. The stepmother, however, could not contain herself. In a sudden surge of panic and rage, she lunged toward the girl, a hand raised as though to strike. But before it could land, lightning split the sky directly above her, a brilliant, searing line of light that blinded her instantly. She staggered back, scream cut short by the flash, hands flailing, eyes burned by the unrelenting brightness. The children shrieked, tumbling to the floor, and the girl did not flinch. She stood steady, her gaze fixed, as if the lightning had merely punctuated her authority, an extension of the storm that had risen with her from the grave. The family's cries mingled with the thunder, a chaotic symphony of fear and regret. The girl's voice rang out once more, quieter now but no less commanding, "You will remember me not as I was, but as what your cruelty created. The love you withheld, the care you denied, will be reflected back upon you in every joy you seek. You will not escape the consequences of your neglect." Each word seemed to reverberate in the walls, the floor, and the soaked earth beyond the house. The rain continued unabated, flowing through open windows and pooling around the threshold. The wind howled as if celebrating the justice delivered, carrying away the echoes of the stepmother's blinded panic and the children's terrified whispers. Shadows stretched and twisted across the walls, cast by lightning flashes that revealed the full horror of what had been wrought by neglect. And yet, in the center of it all, the girl remained composed, a figure of sorrow and authority, a living embodiment of the storm that had mourned her burial. By the time the night drew on, the family was broken. Not physically but spiritually, their pride shattered, their confidence eroded by the force of what they had ignored and the fury of what had returned. They huddled together, soaked, shivering, unable to meet her gaze, unable to speak, bound by fear and guilt. The storm outside seemed to soften slightly, but the rhythm of the rain still mirrored the girl's pulse, a reminder that her power had not diminished. And so, in that long rain-lashed night, the reckoning was complete. The girl, buried without tears, had returned to demand recognition, to exact the justice denied to her in life. The storm was her witness, the lightning her sword, and the family left trembling, a testament to the unstoppable force of grief and vengeance when love is withheld and cruelty prevails. The storm, which had raged with a fury unmatched in living memory, began to soften as dawn approached. Lightning still flashed occasionally, distant and less threatening, while the wind whispered through the trees rather than howling like a wild animal. The rain fell in gentle streams now, pattering on roofs and pooling in the muddy paths, carrying with it the lingering scent of earth freshly washed by the heavens' tears. The air was thick with dampness, but it was no longer oppressive. It carried a strange sense of release, as if the village itself had exhaled after a long-held breath. Word of the girl's return spread quickly, reaching every corner of the village. By mid-morning, those who had survived the storm, shivering, soaked and weary, began to gather near the yard where she had first risen. Some fell to their knees immediately, bowing heads to the ground, a mixture of reverence and fear in their hearts. "We wronged you," they whispered, barely daring to look up. "We neglected you. Forgive us." Others, braver or perhaps too terrified to kneel, stood at a distance, peering from behind trees and walls, eyes wide, trembling, unwilling to approach what they still could not fully comprehend. Some fled altogether, running from the courtyard and the rain-soaked figure that moved with unearthly grace, as if the very earth parted to make way for her. She appeared at the edge of the yard, soaked, hair clinging to her shoulders, eyes glowing faintly even in the soft morning light. Her gaze swept over the villagers, calm yet powerful, measuring their fear, their guilt, their reverence. She did not speak, not immediately, there was no need. The silence carried her authority, a quiet that was heavier than the storm itself, a weight that pressed into every corner of the village. Mothers held their children close, men bowed slightly, and even the boldest among them could not meet her eyes for long. The stepmother, still recovering from the blinding lightning and the terror of the previous night, fell to her knees, hands pressed against the wet earth. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the rain as she whispered prayers and apologies that seemed hollow even to her own ears. The children clung to her skirts, shivering, eyes fixed on the glowing figure who had emerged from death itself. She did not move toward them, did not speak, did not raise her hand in mercy or vengeance. She simply stood, observing, her presence enough to remind them of what they had failed to cherish when she had been alive. For a long moment, the village seemed suspended in time. The rain, which had once been a torrent of judgment, now fell softly as if in mourning still, yet gentle enough to wash away fear rather than intensify it. The wind carried whispers of her name, spoken in awe and dread alike, through the open fields and past the houses, touching even those who had fled to the hills or forest beyond. It was a quiet reckoning, a final acknowledgement that the life once neglected had returned, and that justice, however silent or dramatic, had been served. Then, as suddenly as she had risen, she moved. Her steps were deliberate and fluid, each one leaving faint ripples in the puddles that reflected her faintly glowing form. The villagers held their breath, some bowing, some backing away, and a few daring to follow her eyes with quiet hope. She walked toward the mountains that loomed beyond the village, their peaks shrouded in mist, each step a reminder that she belonged neither to the living nor to the dead. The earth beneath her feet seemed to yield, the rain following her as if it were a cloak, a shroud woven of the storm that had birthed her return. The stepmother tried to call her back, but no sound escaped, and the girl did not look over her shoulder. The children whimpered, the villagers whispered, but none dared move forward. She was beyond their reach now, a force of sorrow, justice, and the unseen power of the heavens. The puddles reflected her silhouette as she receded into the distance, merging with mist and mountain shadow, the rain trailing behind like a veil of memory and consequence. By the time she disappeared from sight, the sky had begun to clear. Clouds parted, revealing a pale morning sun that glinted off the drenched village rooftops. The air felt lighter, though the memory of the storm remained etched into the hearts of those who had witnessed it. The village would never forget the girl, nor the night the sky wept for one buried without tears. She had returned, claimed her place between life and death, and vanished, leaving behind a village forever changed, aware at last of the weight of neglect and the power of grief respected and avenged. Years had passed since the night the girl had risen from her grave and walked silently through the village, leaving behind the trembling family and the echo of the storm that had accompanied her return. The village itself had changed in subtle and profound ways. Fields were tended with greater care, and children were taught the stories of kindness and neglect, of cruelty and justice. The elders who had survived that fateful night grew gray and stooped, their faces lined not only with age but with the memory of the girl who had returned from death to remind them of their own humanity. By the firesides and in the shadowed corners of homes, the story was told and retold, a cautionary tale passed from parent to child. Never bury a soul without love, the elders would begin, their voices low and grave, for the sky remembers what men forget. Every listener, no matter how young or old, shivered at the words, sensing that beyond the caution lay a truth that could not be denied. The story was not told for fear alone, but to honor the memory of a life ignored, to remind the villagers of the fragile weight carried by each human soul. The site of her grave, once a shallow mound hastily covered by indifferent hands, had become a place of quiet reverence. Villagers, both old and young, now approached it with care, bringing offerings of flowers, grain, and small tokens of respect. Some knelt to pray, asking for blessings of rain for the crops, for the health of their families, or for the courage to live with kindness. Even in the harshest seasons, when drought threatened the fields, the villagers would gather there, waiting, certain that the spirit who had once risen in the storm still watched over them. The mound, now reinforced with stone and adorned with simple carvings, seemed to breathe softly under the touch of visitors, as though acknowledging their devotion. The elders often spoke of strange occurrences near the grave, events that could not be explained by ordinary means. On nights when the clouds gathered thick and dark, some claimed they could see a pale figure walking slowly among the rain, hair wet and clinging, eyes faintly glowing, silent yet unmistakable. Farmers returning late from distant fields swore they glimpsed her silhouette moving along the paths they had walked countless times, a quiet reminder of the power of sorrow respected. Children would press their faces to windows, hoping to catch a fleeting glimpse, half in fear and half in fascination. Even those who had never been present the night of her rising felt the pull of her story, drawn to the yard in reverent awe whenever the skies darkened. Over time the tale grew into more than just a story, it became legend. Travelers passing through the village would hear whispers of the girl who had returned from the grave, of the storm that had accompanied her, and of the justice that had been served upon those who had wronged her. Some laughed at the notion, dismissing it as folklore, while others, particularly those who had witnessed the storm firsthand, nodded gravely, convinced of its truth. They carried the story onward, ensuring that the memory of the girl and her quiet power stretched far beyond the village, embedding itself into the lore of the land. Villagers would sometimes gather during storms, watching the sheets of rain and the jagged flashes of lightning with a mix of fear, awe, and reverence. They whispered her name softly, asking for protection, guidance, or simply the blessing of rain for the thirsty crops. The air itself seemed to respond, carrying with it a faint whisper, a subtle stirring of wind and water, as though the girl still walked among them, unseen but present. In this way she became both guardian and cautionary figure, a bridge between life and death, sorrow and justice. Even as decades passed, the stepmother's descendants remembered the tales, and they approached the mound with nervous respect, aware that neglect carried consequences. They did not speak of punishment in the mundane sense, but of a deeper reckoning, that which had been denied in life could rise again in ways the living could not control. And in this awareness the village as a whole became kinder, gentler, more attentive to the lives around them. Each child was taught to care for others, to respect the dead, and to understand that love withheld could never be fully reclaimed. On certain evenings, when the sky gathered heavy with clouds and the wind whispered through the hills, the villagers would look toward the mountains and see a fleeting shadow, pale and luminous, moving just beyond the reach of human understanding. Some claimed it was her, walking again through the storm, a reminder that she belonged neither fully to the living nor to the dead, a presence that transcended both. Others said it was only the imagination, the mind's way of filling in the legend that had become part of their daily lives. Yet no one could deny the strange feeling of awe and respect that settled over the village when the storm approached, a subtle vibration in the air, a heartbeat in the soil, a whisper of a girl who had returned to demand remembrance. In this way the legend lived on. The village had been changed forever, shaped by a life that had once been ignored, a death that had been unremarkable to all but the heavens, and a return that had brought judgment, sorrow, and ultimately respect. And though she walked beyond the reach of mortal eyes, her presence lingered, a force of nature intertwined with the sky itself. When clouds gathered and rain began to fall, some villagers swore they could see her figure moving within the storm, hair dark and wet, eyes glowing faintly, silent, yet watching, reminding all who lived that the weight of a soul denied cannot be forgotten, not by men, not by the earth, and certainly not by the sky.